From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome everyone to the Library of Congress. Tonight we're here to celebrate the completion of the second term of our 19th Laureate Consultant in Poetry of the United States, Natasha Trethewey. Her absolutely remarkable tenure has consistently and dramatically expanded, and the power of this position, which is the only national literary honor for an American that is created by an act of Congress. Of the 17 previous Poets Laureate that I have appointed in my capacity here as Librarian of Congress, only 7 others have served more than one term. Howard Nemeroff, Rita Dove, Robert Haas, Robert Pinsky, Billy Collins, Ted Kooser, and Kay Ryan. Each one, in his or her own way, helped to find and extend the role and outreach of the laureateship. Extending the role of the laureate is not an explicit requirement of the position, but each of those 7 predecessors of Natasha developed signature projects to extend the reach of poetry, such as the American Life in Poetry, the Favorite Poem Project, Poetry 180, which had poems read with every morning announcement over a PA system in thousands of schools around America, Poetry for the Mind's Joy, which Kay Ryan took into the community colleges, which didn't have professors of poetry, but packed everywhere to hear her and talk with her. Poetry of the Mind's Joy, that was. And all of them championed the art as essential to our everyday lives and to all people. Now, during Natasha's first term, she gave an introductory reading to a capacity crowd here in the Coolidge, and a few months later, a reading of Civil War-themed poems in connection and conjunction with our exhibit on the Civil War in America. She was not content simply to deliver her concluding first-term lecture. She also invited 5 award-winning poets to read on the theme, Necessary Utterance, Poetry as Cultural Force. Arguably the most impressive undertaking she took in her first term was to come into residence here in Washington, D.C., and hold absolutely open office hours at the library. For 5 months, she met with members of the general public, excuse me, up in the library's rather beautiful Poetry and Literature Center, hearkening back to a tradition that had been established by early consultants in poetry, who were in effect the predecessors of the library's present Poet Laureate. But past consultants did not have to fit their office hours, which were more limited in any case, around the kind of schedule that Natasha took on in addition. Often in a few days between her meetings, she would travel to 2 or 3 different locations around the country to give readings or talks. When Natasha's second term began last September, she took on a different kind of nationwide work with a signature project called Where Poetry Lives. And believe me, wherever she went, it lived. This project became part of the PBS NewsHour Poetry Series. Natasha traveled with NewsHour senior correspondent Jeffrey Brown for a series of on-location reports which explored all kinds of social and national issues, but always through the uplifting focus and lens of poetry itself. And of course, she recites, as well as she writes, poetry in a very memorable way. Anyhow, she and Jeff together visited a center in Brooklyn that used poetry to help Alzheimer's patients, a doctor at Harvard Medical School who runs a poetry workshop with his residents for very sick people. She read poetry and discussed it at a juvenile detention center in Seattle that gives inmates an outlet to address their struggles, and among many others. They also shot a segment with Natasha participating in the 14th Congressional Civil Rights Pilgrimage, reading poems to members of Congress in her native Mississippi. As part of the segment, Natasha wrote in her online Poet's Notebook, and now I'm quoting her, "I was reminded that a lack of awareness of the past, forgetting, and willed amnesia are easy. The necessary work of remembering is harder. Poetry gives us a way to look at our past unflinchingly, to see it clearly. It is also transformative, this is all her quotes, as it gives us a way to imagine our future, the just and humane society we continue to build, our more perfect union," end of quotes. Tonight, Natasha will continue to show how poetry is an essential form of remembrance and reckoning with her lecture titled "The World of Action and Liability on Saying What Happens." And though this lecture marks an official end to her duties as Poet Laureate of the United States, it also lays the groundwork of what is to come. Natasha is among the youngest Poets Laureate. She has much work ahead of her, first and foremost writing poems that prove true to one of her favorite quotes from William Butler Yeats. And I'm quoting Yeats now. "Out of the quarrel with others, we make rhetoric. Out of the quarrel with ourselves, we make poetry." We can also look forward to Natasha's forthcoming memoir on her history and on the nature of memory. And she can continue to serve as a public intellectual, speaking with a poetic voice, but speaking with the depth which poetry alone can sometimes take us to. And rather in the mold of her predecessor, who was actually the first Poet Laureate, Robert Penn Warren. Anyhow, she is a poet who speaks across divides with both authority and compassion in a language we all need to hear, both in person and on the printed page. Her laureateship has been a gift to this library, to this community, to our country, and her commitment to a more perfect union will continue to make good on the dream of our forefathers. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful Poet Laureate of the United States, Natasha Trethewey.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow, thank you. I am delighted to address you tonight and to reflect upon some things I've been thinking about during my 2 terms in this office. But first, I owe my deepest gratitude to the Librarian of Congress, Dr. James H. Billington, who offered me these 2 years and whose love of poetry, a deep and abiding knowledge of it, is not only a gift, but also an inspiration. He is our nation's foremost champion of poetry. I must also thank Mrs. Billington for her warmth and graciousness that made me feel each time I saw her as though I had been welcomed into a lovely family. Rob Casper, head of the Poetry and Literature Center, for his unwavering support, infectious enthusiasm, and friendship. And to everyone at the Library of Congress, Carolyn Brown, Roberta Schaefer, Bob Dizard, John Cole, Donna Urschel, Matthew Blakely, Gail Osterberg, Rachel Carstens, Caitlin Rizzo, there are too many of you to name. I extend my unending gratitude for making the time I've spent here the most memorable of my life. It has been indeed my highest honor to serve the nation in poetry at this particular historical moment, the 150th and 50th anniversaries of the Civil War and major victories of the Civil Rights Movement. And it seems altogether fitting to consider the legacies of these histories in my own calling as a poet, the legacy of my Southern predecessor, Robert Penn Warren, on American poetry and the laureateship, and the role of American poetry in remembering our shared past and contending with it in our ongoing pursuit of social justice. I'm calling my remarks today The World of Action and Liability, on saying what happens. I was born in Mississippi in 1966, the child of an interracial marriage when such marriages were still illegal there and in as many as 20 states in the nation. So I see my coming into being and my coming to being a writer as deeply rooted in the intersection of these two histories. I was born on the uniquely Southern holiday, Confederate Memorial Day, 100 years after it was first celebrated as an act of defiance in my home state. I was born in a South still trying to hang on to the vestiges of Jim Crow, 2 years after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and a year after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, in the aftermath of Freedom Summer, the summer that several young men entered a night in Mississippi from which they did not return. James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, 3 civil rights workers abducted and murdered in Neshoba County. I witnessed as a small child the burning of a cross beside my grandmother's house, an act of terrorism that might have been directed at us, the interracial family living there, or at the black church across the street where, during the day, volunteers were holding a voter registration drive for disenfranchised African American citizens. Perhaps it was because of both. I was born in a state home to the region called the most southern place on earth for its history of violence, racism, and injustice, a place that, nonetheless, I love because it made me. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry, W.H. Auden wrote in his memorial to William Butler Yeats. My Mississippi, my native land, with its brutal history of oppression and its terrible beauty, hurt me into poetry, rooting me at the crossroads of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, staking my claim there. Contemplating that crossroads, that intersection of two of the most defining moments in American history, I think of the work of Robert Penn Warren, his relationship to history, to his native South, and to the nation, its noble ideals laid down in our founding documents. So too, we might say, wrote poet Ed Hirsch, that the madness of any country's brutality has wounded its poets into poetry. It might seem odd to those who think of Warren as simply an unreconstructed agrarian and a poet who expressed notions of black inferiority in such poems as Pondy Woods, published in 1942, the line spoken by a buzzard to a black fugitive, "Nigger, your breed ain't metaphysical," that I would look to his work as a model of evolving enlightenment and as an example of poetry's way of showing us the possibility of justice and equality. What I want to point out is that we miss something of the transformative power of language across time and space when we consider only certain works in isolation and not a writer's body of work across a lifetime with its revisions and repudiations, as well as its holding fast to some earlier iterations. Warren's permutations throughout his work are particularly relevant to our historical moment in which the pursuit of justice is frequently undermined by a lack of accountability, both personal and societal. When Robert Penn Warren was invited to the Library of Congress in 1986 to be the first Poet Laureate Consultant in poetry, after an act of Congress had officially renamed the post in order to increase its visibility, he was not new to the office, having already served as the poetry consultant from 1944 to 1945. In his early remarks, Warren indicated his unwillingness to allow the name change to alter the role of the poet at the library. He would not be a hired applauder, he declared, or write poems about the president's pets. As a consultant, I haven't done that either. As a consultant, he has been among the poets such as James Dickey, William Meredith, William J. Smith, and Gwendolyn Brooks, who wrote poems that address social issues in our troubled national history: war, racial injustice, the forced relocation of Native Americans. Indeed, in becoming our nation's first official poet laureate, he insisted on the distance inherent in the post that freed American poets to write whatever they must, and freed them from the duty, as in other nations, of writing poems glorifying or celebrating the government. Instead, he represented, in his work as a poet and public intellectual, someone deeply engaged with history, well-positioned, whose voice could speak to contemporary issues of justice in the most elegant language we have. Perhaps more than any other laureate, Warren also represented, in his own public life and art, in the many years between his first term in the library and his second appointment nearly half a century later, a blueprint for change, the ongoing pursuit of a more just society, and the role of poetry in that pursuit. Warren was born in Guthrie, Kentucky in 1905, grandson of a Confederate soldier, inheritor of a Southern culture and ideology rooted in notions of racial difference and predicated upon segregation and social inequality. But the young man who wrote the essay, The Briar Patch, what he would later call a cogent and humane defense of segregation for the 1930 publication of I'll Take My Stand, The South and the Agrarian Tradition, was not the same one to be named our nation's first poet laureate. In that early essay, already exhibiting more progressive leanings than his fugitive agrarian colleagues, Warren still had a long way to go. The journey of his ongoing ideological evolution can be easily charted in his public activities and in his prose. His participation in the civil rights movement, the publication at the war's 100th anniversary in 1961 of his powerful meditation, The Legacy of the Civil War, with its pointed critique of white Americans, South and North, who were evading reality, not only of the past, but also of the contemporary moment, that is, the civil rights movement, by means of what he called the great alibi for Southerners and the treasury of virtue for Northerners. Warren makes use of a third-person narrative structured as a would-be interview to pose his most difficult questions. Of the Southerner who might have stood for Warren himself, he writes, "At the same time, the Southerner's attitude toward the situation is frozen. He may say, in double vision of self-awareness, that he wishes he could feel and act differently, but cannot. I have heard a Southerner say, 'I pray to feel different, but so far I can't help it.'" Furthermore, he writes, as he hears his own lips parroting the sad cliches of 1850, does the Southerner sometimes wonder if the words are his own? Does he ever for a moment feel the desperation of being caught in some great time machine, like a treadmill, and doomed to an eternal effort without progress? Or feel, like Sisyphus, the doom of pushing a great stone up a hill only to have the weight, like guilt, roll back over him over and over again? When he lifts his arm to silence protest, does he ever feel, even fleetingly, that he is lifting it against some voice deep in himself? The sentiment of that last sentence, the reckoning with some voice deep in himself, is the bedrock of Warren's work. It appears earlier in another work of nonfiction, his slender volume, Segregation, The Inner Conflict in the South, published in 1956, 2 years after the Supreme Court, in the Brown v. Board of Education decision, ruled that segregation in public education was unconstitutional. Warren embarked on a journey back to his South to interview the people there, to take stock of what they were thinking in the aftermath of the landmark decision. Here, the technique of the interview guiding the meditation provides a glimpse into Warren's own inner conflict. In the introduction to the book, he asserts that he makes the journey to look at the faces, to hear the voices, to hear, in fact, the voices in my own blood. For Warren, the trip is a pilgrimage. After relaying several of the interviews he conducted throughout the journey, Warren closes with one last interview that he declared, "I wish to put on record," presenting it by question and answer. Early on, the interviewee tries to explain, by way of a story, the inheritance of a troubled history that, in the absence of conscious action against perpetuating the vestiges of it in the contemporary moment, make it difficult for white Americans to live with themselves. He describes an elderly white woman who grew up in a black county, but a county where relations had been, as they say, good. He continues, "She had a fine farm and a good brick house, and when she got old, she sort of retired from the world. The hottest summer weather, and she would lock all the doors and windows at night and lie there in the airless dark. But sometimes she'd telephone that somebody was burning the Negroes out there on her place. She could hear their screams. Something was going on in her old head, which in another place and time would not have been going on in her old head. She had never, I should think, seen an act of violence in her life, but something was going on in her head." And then, question, "Do you think it is chiefly the redneck who causes violence?" Answer, "No, he is only the cutting edge. He too is a victim. Responsibility is a seamless garment, and the northern boundary of that garment is not the Ohio River." Question, "Are you for desegregation?" Answer, "Yes." The word presented emphatically in italics, a repudiation. This final conversation, covering a range of contemporary concerns about and historical issues raised by the new civil rights advancing legislation, from the fear of racial amalgamation to the way that the South and thus the nation must now learn to live, ends with a single line. Warren writes, "This is, of course, an interview with myself." It is in that final sentence that we can measure the way Warren's persona as a public intellectual in his works of social criticism is inextricably linked to what many critics hail as his best, most significant work as a poet. By the time Warren published Segregation, he had already begun his profound reckoning with the impact of history on the American imagination, making use of the formal scaffolding of the interview and the rhetorical device, the argument with the self, in his stunning book-length poem, Brother to Dragons, which appeared in print the first time in 1953. "We make of the quarrel with others rhetoric," wrote poet William Butler Yeats, "but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry." Warren's social criticism, his rhetoric, certainly had the power to influence the thinking of others, but I argue that the quarrel with himself, his poetry, is a grander model for displaying his process of ideological evolution, and thus even more influential. It allows us to see ourselves in the mirror of his own reckoning. During his time at the Library of Congress in 1944 to 1945, Robert Penn Warren would have likely begun to be aware of African Americans' increasing expectations for justice, and in that period of rising civil rights activism, begun to use the holdings at the library to research the historical actors and the events that are at the center of Brother to Dragons. That central event, the dismemberment and murder of a young slave by his owner, Lilburn Lewis, nephew to Thomas Jefferson, occurred in Warren's native Kentucky in 1811, and as a boy, he'd heard the folklore surrounding the story. He had begun his preliminary research in the archives of a county courthouse in Smithfield, Kentucky, looking through the transcripts of Lewis's trial. The poem includes many voices. The characters, all but one of them, long dead, include Thomas Jefferson, Lilburn Lewis, his wife and brothers, Lucy Lewis, sister to Jefferson and their mother, their father, Colonel Charles Lewis, the slave to whom Warren gives the name John, an imagined slave woman, Aunt Cat, who had served as a wet nurse to Lilburn, and Meriwether Lewis, who, with Clark, carried out the expedition to open the Louisiana Territory. The final character is called RPW, representing the poet himself, who is in conversation with the rest of the characters. In his notes to the book, Warren details some of his findings in the historical record, as well as the absences and what cannot be known explicitly. It is Warren's contention, based on his research and conversations with historians, that Jefferson most likely knew of the events in his extended family, but would not or could not bring himself to say anything about them. That is, to record anything about them in print. Thus, Warren must rely on speculation, a tool not foreign to historians, to piece together a narrative concerned not only with what happened, as documented in the records, but why it could have happened. In that way, Warren attempts to examine not only the facts of the past, but also to historicize human nature, to consider the actions of human beings not in a vacuum, but as a response to culture and society. This is one kind of work that poetry can do. For Warren, it involves a certain amount of invention, a way to focus on a larger truth about the human condition rather than merely the facts of it. Of the liberties he takes in the poem, Warren writes, "I know that any discussion of the relation of this poem to its historical materials is, in one perspective, irrelevant to its value, and it could be totally accurate as history and still not worth a dime as a poem. I am trying to write a poem, not a history, and therefore have no compunction about tampering with non-essential facts. But poetry is more than fantasy and is committed to the obligation of trying to say something, however obliquely, about the human condition. Therefore, a poem dealing with history is no more at liberty to violate what the writer takes to be the spirit of his history than it is at liberty to violate what he takes to be the nature of the human heart. And furthermore, historical sense and poetic sense should not, in the end, be contradictory. For if poetry is the little myth we make, history is the big myth we live, and in our living, constantly remake." Warren convenes his cast of historical characters to have a conversation with each other in which they not only describe the details of the recorded event, the brutal murder and some other events in its wake, the burning of the dismembered body, the trial, but also to dramatize the workings of the psyche, that is, to have a quarrel not only with the characters involved in the event, but also with the self. This is also the work of poetry. It allows us, as readers, to inhabit the consciousness of others, expanding our capacity for empathy. The poem opens with the voice of Thomas Jefferson, who begins by describing the difficulty of letting go the past. "My name is Jefferson, Thomas. I lived, died, but dead cannot lie down in the dark, cannot, though dead, set my mouth to the dark stream that I may unknow all my knowing, cannot, for if, kneeling in that final thirst, I thrust down my face, I see come glimmering upward, white, white out of the absolute dark of depth, my face, and it is only human." This opening imagery, Jefferson unable to drink from the river of forgetting so as to rest because he is confronted again and again with his own face, forced to see it mirrored in the water, sets the tone for the poem's reckoning. These historical actors, agents of their own suffering, in a place not unlike purgatory, what Warren called no place, anytime, doomed to relive the tragic events of their connected lives. The next character to speak, to respond to Jefferson, is RPW, a two-line interruption, thus setting up the main discussion between the two of them, who, in many ways, represent two quarreling halves of the poet himself. In this way, the voices of the characters are there not only to tell their own parts of the story, but also to serve a function not unlike that of a Greek chorus, adding to the story, providing more insight, provoking the conversation. It is the character of Jefferson who introduces one of Warren's ongoing themes, present in both his poetry and his prose, the idea that the burden of troubled history is settled down in the blood, that we are inheritors of the past, perhaps unable to escape its trap, as in these lines, in the voice of Jefferson. Time came, we signed the document, went home. I had not seen the eyes of that bright apparition. I had been blind with light. I did not know its eyes were blind. The fat was in the fire, and I who once said, all liberty is bought with blood, must now say, all truth is bought with blood, and the blood is ours, but only truth can make us free, free from the fool lie. And doom is always domestic. It purrs like a cat, and the absolute traitor lurks in some sweet corner of the blood. Here, Warren is contemplating not only the part of human nature capable of blindness or prejudice and oppression, perhaps even violence or willed ignorance of violence based on passed down ideologies, but also this capability present at the same time in someone idealistic, a great thinker of noble thoughts about democracy like Jefferson, whose job had been to set them down on paper in our nation's founding documents. For as much as the poem is about the past, it is also about the contemporary moment in which Warren found himself disillusioned with the failures of our nation in terms of justice for all. The idealism of our national documents, of Jefferson and what he stood for. Throughout the poem, Warren allows the characters RPW and Jefferson to alternately articulate what, in its philosophical musing, can sound like an apologist's position, one who tries to find justification for certain actions, particularly for the violence at the center of the poem, or to lay the blame somewhere else, upon the victim. For example, Jefferson. We are each a child of his own age's womb. Oh, what's one more nigger or less, except he's all, and all responsibility now spreads. It spreads like a stain in water. And then RPW. Well, there's that not unfashionable notion to consider that John, the slave, was in a strange way responsible. And later, says RPW, no, don't blame me. I just report a notion. The victim becomes the essential accomplice, provocateur, and the real victim is he whose hand was fatally elected to give the stroke, but is innocent. Reading the harrowing account of the murder and then the different speakers' ideas about who's guilty and who's innocent is both compelling and almost too hard to take. On one hand, it seems as if Warren is confronting the notion that one must accept responsibility for being linked by blood and position to the oppressors, for carrying forward those ideological positions, and on the other hand, is struggling with the faulty notion that the victims of violence and oppression are as much to blame in provoking the actions of the oppressor, thus rendering the oppressor a victim too. The problem here is the suggestion that the oppressor has no agency, no choice, and that the different forms of victimhood as defined by RPW are morally equivalent. But this is not where he leaves the argument. This is only one particular step along the path toward a different vision of things, perhaps unfinished, but hard-won nonetheless. Poet Seamus Heaney has pointed out that necessary poetry must always touch the base of our sympathetic nature while taking in at the same time the unsympathetic nature of the world to which that nature is constantly exposed. And that poetry has the ability and responsibility to say what happens. Warren's poem, charting its difficult territory, does this work. That he explores these ideas in poems and later applies them in the turning point in segregation in which he wrote of the Southerner, he is trapped in history, and then or is he? Is evidence that his role as a poet concerned with history and its effects on the American imagination is a necessary scaffolding for his role as a public intellectual. We see him grappling with difficult and contradictory ideas, moving from the poems as initial contemplation to his prose, thus armed with a moral authority to project outward, in rhetoric, the argument with his nation, an authority he would not have had without the quarrel with the self that makes poetry. Furthermore, in Warren's poem, we see also his willingness to show an unattractive part of the self, his use of base and essentialist notions to describe and derogatory language to refer to blacks not only by Jefferson and the other characters, but also by RPW, standing in for the poet himself. But niggers don't mind heat, at least not much. Poor nigger stonework, generations gone. Spirit of the nigger boy John. When the revised edition of Brother to Dragons was released in 1979, these elements remained intact, not, I think, because Warren maintained those views, but because he was concerned with creating a true record of man, that is, of his quarrel with himself, by avoiding a revision that would amount to erasure of the past and would present his current self in a tidy, more positive light. In this reiteration, I see Warren's ability to confront his past, to connect him with previous held positions that he has come to see as morally wrong, his recognition that there is a cruelty in language used to diminish and dehumanize, and that where there is willingness to use language in such a way, exists some potential for other cruelty, as implied in these lines. Well, Ishy boy, we sort of kill the nigger. And me, but just a nigger. And my breath got choked, just a nigger, you said. We see also in the following lines the character RPW reflecting on his interactions with blacks back home, his way of being in relation to them in order to question his cultural inheritances, his ideological positions. RPW. Who doesn't know down home the intolerable eye of the sly one and the sibilant confabulation below the threshold of comprehension? What the hell did you say? Me, boss? You mean me? Who the hell you think I mean? Me, boss? Yes, you. What the hell was that you said? Boss? I didn't say nothing. Always nothing, but always something. And in the deep vessel of yourself now the dark dregs are disturbed. Uncoil now, rise to murk the rational ichor of innocence. No use to say you've dealt justly with individuals or held to the most advanced views on the race question. Do you think the dark inquisitor can be deflected by trivialities like that? In the evocation of the intolerable I, we can measure an implied discomfort with that knowing gaze of the blacks, a discomfort rooted in the difficult historical relationships whereby the I indicts. This meditation is among the many ways that Warren's work promotes a vision of the world in which justice reigns, in which we are all held accountable for failures of imagination and empathy, and where we can identify a point along the line to strive for, the arc of the moral universe. Poetry is a means to get there. Near the close of the poem, Jefferson says, "One day I wrote to Adams. I wrote and said that the dream of the future is better than the dream of the past. How could I hope to find courage to say that without the fact of the past, no matter how terrible, we cannot dream the future?" It seems to me that these lines speak to the role of poetry in reckoning with our history and imagining our future, for poetry is concerned not only with the past, it presents a way to look backward and forward at once, showing a world that is possible, what we can work toward. These lines too. But what is knowledge without the intrinsic mediation of the heart? By the close of the book-length poem, we have arrived at a new reckoning. In the final lines, voiced by RPW, he returns to reflecting upon a journey he made earlier in the poem back to the landscape of his native Kentucky and the place of that unthinkable violence, the place that made him, hurt him into a most necessary reckoning in his poetry. RPW. And so I stood on the headland and stared at the river in the last light of December's and the day's declension. I thought of the many dead and the places where they lay. I looked at the shrunken ruin and the trees leafless. The winter makes things small. All things draw in. It is strange how the shift of scale may excite the heart. I leaned above the ruin and in my hand picked up some 2 or 3 pig nuts with the husks yet on. I put them in my pocket. I went down, perhaps never to come back, for I did not know what here remained, at least for me, and to this day have not gone back, but hold in my heart that landscape. I crossed the evening barn lot, opened the sagging gate, and was prepared to go into the world of action and liability. I had long lived in the world of action and liability. But now I passed the gate into a world sweeter than hope in that confirmation of last light. Like Heaney, Warren saw the connection between poetry and responsibility, the world of action and liability. He tells us at the end of the poem that he is now prepared to go into that world, though he had long lived in it, without perhaps the full awareness of his own limitations, nor the full commitment to living a life of connectedness and responsibility. The writing of the poem, the long quarrel with himself, resulted in that preparedness and allows us to see the poet as a public figure in the midst of changing, an elegant blueprint for enlightenment and the pursuit of justice. Ultimately, history is presented in Warren's work not only as a conveyance of facts. What is fabricated, imagined, speculated serves to effect the mediation of the heart that poetry gives us, a way to delve deeper by not only saying what happened, but in so doing, attempting to answer why it happened, to provide a record of the human condition. As poet Adrienne Rich has said, one does have a choice to become consciously historical. That is, a person who tries for memory and connectedness against amnesia and nostalgia, who tries to describe her or his journeys, and that, in a larger sense, historical amnesia is starvation of the imagination, and no ongoing pursuit of knowledge can survive that starvation. Warren makes the choice to be consciously historical, and whether or not his early work bears witness to racist or unreconstructed ideas, or whether or not he reached a point of complete transformation, matters less than the journey he undertakes and sets down on paper for us to see. Reading Warren showed me how to contend in my collection, Native Guard, with my own history, a history of race and the struggle for justice in the American South and in the nation as a whole, and how to make the quarrel I had with my country about our collective forgetting and cultural amnesia a struggle ultimately with myself over the responsibility of remembering and memorialization. Reading Warren, I see the scaffolding of a tradition in American poetry of turning to history in order to deal with difficult knowledge, to grapple with ongoing issues of justice, to reflect upon how and what we remember, how the images of our history, that knowledge, rooted like blood in the body, must be contended with again and again to keep us ever vigilant, lest we forget. I'd like to close by reading a few poems in the context of remembering the civil rights movement. Cornelius Eady's Emmett Till's glass-top casket reckons with a kind of cultural neglect, and a symbol for the necessity of avoiding historical amnesia. Emmett Till was the 14-year-old boy abducted and murdered in 1955 by Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, who would later publicly describe their crime for allegedly whistling at Bryant's wife at their grocery store. Not long ago, Till's body was exhumed for DNA testing, and his former glass-top casket, which his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, buried him in so that, as she said then, the world could see, was abandoned and forgotten. Emmett Till's glass-top casket. By the time they cracked me open again, topside, abandoned in a tool shed, I had become another kind of nest. Not many people connect possums with Chicago, but this is where the city ends after all, and I float still, after the footfalls fade and the roots bloom around us. The fact was, everything that worked for my young man worked for my new tenants. The fact was, he had been gone for years. They lifted him from my embrace, and I was empty, ready. That's how the possums found me, friend, dry-docked, a tattered Mercy hull. Once I held a boy who didn't look like a boy. When they finally remembered, they peeked through my clear top. Then their wild surprise. Edie's poem reminds us not only of the horror of Till's body, his beaten to beyond recognition face, a boy who didn't look like a boy, but also the dangers of forgetting. Two, it is a powerful assertion of the role of poetry in the remembrance and reckoning with our past. Finally, two poems in conversation. One by Robert Frost, the other by Elizabeth Sewell. Sewell, a former British citizen, migrated as a young woman to the United States, where she spent the rest of her life. She was teaching at Tougaloo College in the 1960s when Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the three civil rights workers, were abducted and murdered. Her poem, "The Land Was Theirs Before They Were the Land's," makes use of a line in slightly different form from Robert Frost's famous poem, "The Gift Outright." Here's Frost. The Gift Outright. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were still England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by, possessed by what we now no more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak, until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war, to the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. I can imagine Elizabeth Sewell, having listened to the inauguration of JFK or read somewhere else those words, and thinking of Mississippi, of injustice, people denied their full citizenship and civil rights, asking, where are the words to contend with that? Her poem, "The Land Was Theirs Before They Were the Land's," responds to the notion of manifest destiny and the price of American liberty, furthering the conversation in a way that directly engages with those tumultuous times. The land was theirs before they were the land's, and the sunsets there are as beautiful as anywhere else in the world. Pure fire at first, which sinks, and from ground to zenith rises a blush of rose, above which the solemn blue attends and darkens. So they took the three young men out of the station wagon, which later they burned. And you watch the glow minute by minute, wine juice draining down the universe, the huge purple grape of the sky pricked on the needle of one incredible star. So they faced each other, and there are some who will know the first terrible plunge of fear, then the quick rebinding of the self, the readiness in silence. And then comes the night, black, black intense, and the breeze puffs river and creek smells over the moist black earth and the marshes, and the stars go expanding in the vaporous dark and the miles of quiet. So they begin to work them over, the three, but mostly the dark one. Bones smashed like sugarcane in a molasses of blood. Reduce them, young man by young man, to a sobbing, retching mass, partly conscious, till the three hearts shuddered and stopped to the 5 bullets they shared, unevenly. And the dawns there are white and poignant. New sun slopes down onto soaking dew, long, oblique, colorless rays bursting through trees and hanging moss. And one remembers such a sharp, steamy morning and a small white Mississippi cat prancing over the high, wet grass and the misty beams and shadows, purposeful and absurd and sweet. So they stamped down the untidy holes in the ramp of the half-built dam and left the three, still warm and already rotting, to be thrust deeper and deeper into that hot earth by the innocent machines, while they went back as a matter of course to their homes and their business, to slow speech with human beings, to wiping their little children's faces sticky after their dinner, to the conjugal bed. And now, irrevocably and forever, the land is theirs who gave themselves and were given, who lay with that land a little space in its beauty and their own. So best we bethink ourselves how all of us, and we are all Mississippians, will be called on to honor in terms none can foresee, the gift outright. Those last lines remind us of our own accountability. We are all Mississippians, and what it means to live in the world of action and liability. The poem lives up to its duty to say what happens and is a fitting tribute to those slain civil rights workers, martyrs in the movement for American freedom and justice, and a way to mark this moment. An anniversary that asks us to remember and to continue to do the work we must do in order to perfect our union. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for a terrific lecture. Thanks to all of you for coming out. And I really want to say what a pleasure it's been, what an honor it's been for all of us here at the library to work with Natasha over the past 2 years. She's had a remarkable laureateship. As Dr. Billington noted, her lecture tonight marks the end of her laureateship, but you can continue to appreciate her signature project, Where Poetry Lives, online at the PBS NewsHour. The website is www.pbs.org/newshour. And you can learn more about Natasha and about the laureate position at our website, www.loc.gov/poetry. Now I'd like to invite you to join us in a reception in the Great Hall of the Jefferson Building, and also Natasha will do a book signing. So please continue on in our celebration of her historic laureateship, and stay as long as the food and wine is around. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.